The Pueblo Indians of New Mexico are believed to be descendants of the Anasazi who populated the Four Corners region of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. During the 13th century, the Pueblo Indians began settlements along major rivers, primarily the Rio Grande, which begins in south-central Colorado and flows through the Gulf of Mexico. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado was the first explorer to come in contact with New Mexico's indigenous population at Zia Pueblo in his 1540 to 1542 expedition. The 19 Indian pueblos of New Mexico and their settlements along the Rio Grande are detailed in this map. The Tewa language is spoken in northern and southern pueblos, while the people of the middle Rio Grande region speak the languages of Tewa, Tewa, and Keres. People of the Zuni Pueblo, located to the west, speak their own language of Zuni. The two most northern pueblos are Taos and Picuris. They both speak the language of Tewa. The settlement of Taos Pueblo began between 1200 and 1250 A.D. During the 1540 Coronado expedition, the Spanish explorers first encountered the multi-story dwellings at Taos Pueblo that have become world famous and are synonymous with New Mexico's northernmost pueblo. The expedition of Gaspar Castaño de Sosa was the first to visit Picuris Pueblo in 1591. 7 years later, Juan de Oñate came upon the pueblo and called it San Buenaventura. Tensions between the Pueblo and Spanish settlers continued after the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, and in 1696 the Indians abandoned Picuris. For the next decade, they lived among the Apache groups on the plains. In August 1706, the Picuris returned to their pueblo nestled in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in southern Taos County. The 7,300-foot altitude at Picuris limits the growing season to only 128 days. The 1925 harvest dance pictured here was held in gratitude for the year's bounty. Oke Owinge is the first of 6 pueblos in northern New Mexico who speak the Tewa language. The San Juan Mission Church shown here on the left served as the Roman Catholic parish center for the neighboring Spanish communities during the 19th century. Our Lady of Lourdes Chapel at the center of the Pueblo of San Juan was at the epicenter of events during the latter part of the 16th century that indelibly shaped the history of New Mexico. The Spanish explorer Gaspar de Castaño was the first European to make contact with the Pueblo in 1591 and was a harbinger of change. Castaño erected a huge cross at the Pueblo to mark the beginning of evangelization of the native people. When Juan de Oñate arrived in 1598, he christened the Pueblo San Juan de los Caballeros. In 2005, the Pueblo went back to its original name of Oke Owinge. It was at San Juan Pueblo that the medicine man Popeye began the 1680 Pueblo Revolt that forced the Spanish colonists out of New Mexico for 12 years. Leading up to the revolt in 1676, Popeye and other medicine men from the northern pueblos were taken to the Santa Fe Plaza by Spanish soldiers. They were accused of practicing witchcraft and were publicly flogged to discourage their ceremonies. San Ildefonso Pueblo was the least receptive to Christianity. Not until the 19th century did Roman Catholicism become accepted and began to merge with Aboriginal ceremonialism. Pueblo members enter the kiva in this 1905 photograph. History has falsely referred to the Spanish conquest as a peaceful transition, but many Indians continued to be tortured and killed after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Members of San Ildefonso fled for their safety and fortified themselves in the mountains atop the Black Mesa until 1694. In this photo, a woman from San Ildefonso Pueblo collects water in the early morning of 1905. During prehistoric times, the people of Santa Clara devised an irrigation system that allowed them to divert water from the Rio Grande to its fields at lower elevations. With the system, it freed the Pueblo from being dependent on rainfall for their crops. This 1910 photograph of a water carrier at Santa Clara was identified as the mother of Molly and Francis Chaveria. Santiago Naranjo of Santa Clara Pueblo traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1923 as part of a contingent of Pueblo leaders who opposed the Bursum bill that would have deprived the Pueblos of their land and their water rights. Nambe Pueblo, like the neighboring Pueblo of Pojoaque, has been entrenched with Spanish culture since 1776. Members of this Nambe family, photographed in 1914, were likely among the many Nambe Pueblo people and other Native American groups that were relocated during the Reorganization Act of 1934. Known as the Indian New Deal, the people of Nambe were moved to California under the premise that they would assimilate into American society. After 2 decades, many of them decided to move back to their agrarian way of life, which had been kept intact by the 50 remaining families that had stayed at Nambe Pueblo. Pojoaque Pueblo is the smallest of the 6 Tewa Pueblos. This 1905 photograph of the Pueblo was taken when it was virtually abandoned. From 1912 through 1934, Pojoaque Pueblo was not occupied by tribal members. Many of them lived in the neighboring pueblos or in the immediate vicinity. Antonio Jose Tapia is credited with the resettlement of the Pueblo. After living and working in Colorado in 1912, he returned in the 1930s and worked to bring back other people to live on their native land. Located 8 miles from Santa Fe, Tesuque Pueblo has been surrounded by Spanish and Anglo influences throughout its history, yet it has remained one of the most conservative and traditional pueblos. During the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, 2 of its members figured prominently in the revolt, warning the other pueblos of the date of the first strike. The first blood of the revolt was shed at Tesuque Pueblo on August 9, 1680, with the killing of the Spaniard Cristobal de Herrera. Jemez Pueblo speaks the Tewa language. The Pueblo is located on the east bank of the Jemez River, 25 miles northwest of Bernalillo. More than any other Pueblo, they are considered the Highlanders because of their location in the Jemez Mountains. They are the only Tewa-speaking Pueblo left in New Mexico. It is believed that their present dialect grew out of a combination of the original dialect spoken at the extinct Pueblo of Pecos and that of Jemez, prior to the surviving members of Pecos joining Jemez Pueblo in 1838. The Pueblo of Pecos was located 18 miles southeast of Santa Fe. Primarily a farming community, the population of Pecos had as many as 2,000 inhabitants when Gaspar Castaño de Sosa entered the region in 1590 to 1591. Separated from the other pueblos along the Rio Grande, it was unable to protect itself from attacks from Comanche Indians. With the aftermath of the constant attacks and the epidemic of smallpox, the Pueblo of Pecos continued to dwindle. By 1838, they decided to make a new home with Jemez Pueblo, who spoke their language of Tewa. The Pueblo of Jemez was sympathetic to their plight and welcomed the Pueblo refugees. This photograph of Agustin Pecos was taken in 1914. From 1902 until his death in 1919, he was the last survivor of the 17 people who immigrated from the Pueblo of Pecos in 1838 to Jemez Pueblo. Barely a teenager around the age of 12 or 15, Pecos joined the small group who fled their desolate Pueblo to become part of Jemez. In 1904, Pecos provided the name of the diaspora, which provided invaluable information on the history of the Pueblos of New Mexico. The 7 pueblos that speak Keres begins with Cochiti Pueblo. Juan Jose Montoya poses with a rifle and a shield with his wife Adelita as she grinds corn on a metate, which is a flat oblong stone, in 1880 at the Cochiti Pueblo. Prior to the Spanish colonization of New Mexico, the Pueblo people used bows and arrows for hunting. However, during the 18th century, they adopted the use of the rifle for their hunting. The ability to speak both Spanish and English, along with the geographic knowledge of the area, provided work for local Pueblo men as guides. Pictured here is Jose Hilario Montoya of Cochiti Pueblo, when he was a guide in 1866. 25 years later, in 1891, Jose Hilario Montoya had become the governor of Cochiti Pueblo. Santo Domingo Pueblo is one of the larger pueblos in the central Rio Grande area. Its first village was established in 1776, but due to floods during the next century, it was moved to higher ground where it has been located since 1895. After repeated floods from the Rio Grande, a new location for the kiva at Santo Domingo Pueblo was established in 1881. This unidentified woman at Santo Domingo Pueblo is wearing a headscarf in 1925. The headscarf is indicative of Spanish customs brought to New Mexico by the European settlers who traveled along the Camino Real that ran parallel to the Pueblo during the 17th and 18th centuries. San Felipe Pueblo took part in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and even killed some of its own people on the Pueblo who declined to participate. This view of San Felipe Pueblo was taken around 1880 near the old church, 650 feet above the Pueblo, with the Black Mesa in the background. A pauper boy who was the son of a couple executed for practicing witchcraft at Zia Pueblo is shown in this 1890 photo. The Pueblo's isolation also fostered the witch mania that the Rio Grande Pueblos of Zia, Sandia, Santa Ana, Santa Clara, and Nambe experienced during the 17th and 18th centuries. During the 17th century, colonial records made reference to the witchcraft trials of that era, due in part from the European superstitions brought from the Old World. The plight of human misery was often blamed on the deliberate misuse of people knowledgeable in the black arts. Rock art that was discovered by archaeologists often depicted carved or painted pictures at cliff dwellings of fetishes and ceremonial objects that strongly suggested the reality of otherworldly forces used by the earliest inhabitants of the Rio Grande Valley. In this 1890 photograph, a woman of Zia Pueblo is carrying her baby. From a population of at least 5,000 people, Zia Pueblo was reduced to a mere 300 after 150 years of Spanish rule. Their demise was attributed to disease, murder, and forceful removal from their native lands at the hands of the Spaniards. Santa Ana Pueblo is the last of the 5 eastern Keres-speaking pueblos located in the central Rio Grande Valley. The Pueblo of Santa Ana, along with that of Zia, was destroyed during the Pueblo Revolt. The revolt and aftermath caused repeated dislocations for the people at Santa Ana, who took refuge with other pueblos in the Jemez Mountains. Although New Mexico's 19 Indian pueblos may speak different languages and differ in customs, they all utilize the kiva for their sacred ceremonies. This is a 1925 photograph of the kiva at Santa Ana Pueblo. Jesus Antonio Montoya was the governor of Santa Ana Pueblo in 1899. The Spanish government gave each pueblo a silver crown cane to signify leadership and sovereignty. A Christian cross was engraved in the head of the cane, indicating that it had the blessing of the Catholic Church. Later on, these canes became known as the Lincoln canes. Laguna Pueblo women collect water near the pueblo in 1908. Laguna Pueblo was established mostly by Keresian refugees who chose not to return to their homes after the Spanish regained control in 1692. They formed their own pueblo 14 miles northeast of Acoma. Laguna Pueblo was formally established in 1699, 7 years before the founding of the city of Albuquerque. During the last quarter of the 19th century, Isleta experienced a transformation when a group from Laguna Pueblo became a part of their pueblo. This integration occurred when 3 Laguna women married Protestant men, which caused a fissure at the pueblo. The newcomers wanted the pueblo to break away from the stronghold of 3 centuries of Catholicism. Unable to contend with the strife, several families fled to Isleta. Divine providence brought a jolt of spirituality during the second half of the 19th century. Just as the Spanish explorers believed themselves to be superior when they arrived, the Anglo-Saxons who colonized the eastern seaboard thought they were entitled to claim America as their own. Known as the 1845 Manifest Destiny Decree, they were following a preordained path laid out for them by God as they pursued a westward expansion. These water carriers trekked back to the Acoma Pueblo in 1905. Built on a 367-foot sandstone bluff mesa, Acoma Pueblo has been in existence since at least 1150 AD. Acoma Pueblo is famous not only for its sweeping vistas high above its home on the mesa, but more so for the brutal treatment they endured under Spanish rule. Juan de Oñate ordered the execution of many Pueblo men, while the remaining ones who survived had one of their feet severed. This photo of San Esteban Mission Church was taken at Acoma Pueblo in 1904. Construction of the first mission church began under the guidance of Fray Juan Ramirez in 1629 and was completed in 1641. The Pueblo people of Acoma had to carry the massive stones for the foundation of the building up a high and treacherous footpath. They also hauled mounds of earth from below to make the adobe bricks that comprised the entire 3,600-foot structure. The completement of this monumental work by the people at Acoma provided them with a great sense of pride. During the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, other pueblos destroyed their churches, but Acoma refused to destroy the church that they had worked so hard to build. Zuni Pueblo is the westernmost pueblo in New Mexico, located 120 miles west of the Rio Grande and 75 miles away from Acoma Pueblo. It is the only pueblo in New Mexico to speak Zuni, a language unrelated to those of other pueblos in the state. In 1776, Zuni was the largest village in New Mexico, with documentation stating that Zuni had 1,617 souls, more so than the capital city of Santa Fe. Because of its distance from any other settlement, Zuni had to endure the constant threat of attack by the Gila, Apache, and Navajo Indians. Its remote location was deemed by the Franciscan clergy as a Christian outpost that few wanted to serve. During the Pueblo Revolt, the people of Zuni took refuge atop the mountain mesas. They returned in 1692 to a single village from their former establishment that had consisted of 5 other towns. The Pueblo's isolation also fostered the witch mania that the Rio Grande Pueblos of Zia, Sandia, Santa Ana, Santa Clara, and Nambe experienced during the 17th and 18th centuries. In the summer of 1881, the ethnologist Frank Hamilton Cushing took a group of tribal leaders from Zuni Pueblo to the East Coast. They traveled by train and were welcomed to the nation's capital by President Chester A. Arthur. They went on to Boston, where they performed an ancient ceremony to replenish the sacred supply of seawater in the Atlantic Ocean. When the group continued to Salem, Massachusetts, the Zuni men publicly commended the citizens of their ancestors' diligent persecution of those tried at the Salem witch trials during the colonial era between 1692 and 1693. The Boston Herald reported on the outcome of this event by their exotic visitors from the Southwest. Their readership was flummoxed and reticent, not wanting to relive that dark era in their history. The famous witch trials at Zuni Pueblo continued through the end of the 19th century. The sacred Bow priesthood was Zuni's most important priesthood. It was the responsibility of the Bow priesthood to determine and mete out punishment of those suspected of practicing witchcraft. The torture and execution of witches became an accepted feature of daily life on the Pueblo. Merida, the old Zuni woman pictured in this photo, was accused of witchcraft and tortured by the priests of the Bow. She was rescued by Protestant missionaries in 1897. The people of Zuni Pueblo sought the help of medicine men in warding off and extracting spells brought on by witches. These medicine men were sometimes accused by witchcraft by the same people who sought their help in warding off evil spirits. In 1923, the New Mexico Pueblo delegation protesting the Bursum bill arrived in Washington, D.C. Representatives from several of New Mexico's pueblos traveled to the nation's capital to bring attention to the inequity of the proposed bill. Introduced to Congress in 1922 by New Mexico Senator Holm Bursum, the proposed legislation pertained to quiet land titles within the Pueblo Indian land grants. The proposed law would benefit trespassers by confirming that all non-Pueblo land claims 10 years prior to 1912 also affected water rights. Far from providing justice for the Indians, the bill would have deprived them of 60,000 acres of their ancestral land and water. A group of New Mexico intellectuals and artists joined forces to oppose the bill with the campaign Let's Save the Pueblos, which inflamed public furor and brought pressure to Congress to recall the bill. The heated debate surrounding the Bursum bill aroused national interest on Indian rights that paved the way for future reforms in government policy toward the Indians. Sandia and Isleta are the only two pueblos in New Mexico that speak Southern Tewa. For unknown reasons, Sandia Pueblo has been ignored by historians and anthropologists, and there is less documentation on their history. What is known about the Pueblo, which is located 15 miles north of Albuquerque, is that prior to 1680, it had a population of at least 3,000. Many of its people were either killed during the Pueblo Revolt or fled for their safety. By 1733, the Pueblo had been abandoned, and not until 1748 did they return from Hopi land. Documentation states that when Sandia was resettled, it was a mix of refugees from various pueblos and that it had possessed different characteristics prior to the revolt. With the new settlement, Sandia now had a strong Keresian influence, more so than any other non-Keres pueblo. The ancient Tewa word for Sandia is Nafayet, place where the wind blows dust. During the 16th century, the Spanish colonists renamed the mountaintop range Sandia, the Spanish word for watermelon, because the red glow of the mountains at sunset reminded them of watermelon. The Sandia Mountains are a backdrop in this 1919 event at Sandia Pueblo. Mariano Carpintero, a tribal chief at Sandia Pueblo in 1899, was photographed for the Smithsonian Institute's Bureau of Ethnology in Washington, D.C. Carpintero chose to be photographed with the silver-crowned cane of Pueblo authority. Isleta Pueblo was the only Pueblo in New Mexico that did not participate in the Pueblo Revolt. At the time, they were on friendly terms with the Spaniards and allowed them to take refuge at the Pueblo during the revolt. However, they were not spared from the violence that surrounded them and soon fled south to El Paso and Mexico. Upon their return after 1692, the Pueblo once again prospered due in part to their location. Their proximity to the Rio Grande allowed them to irrigate their fields regularly. Unlike some of the pueblos to the west, Isleta was not dependent on dry farming and the advent of rain for their survival. In this photograph, a 101-year-old woman holds a baby at Isleta Pueblo in 1890. This woman, who was born in 1789, was 11 when a group from Laguna Pueblo became a part of Isleta. This 1890 photo shows an Isleta Pueblo hunter with his daily catch resting on his shoulder. Rabbit hunting was common around the Manzano Mountains east of the Pueblo. The Pueblo also fished along the Rio Grande and in surrounding mountain streams. Unlike some of the other Pueblos, Isleta was not dependent on dry farming because of the 4 ditches from the Rio Grande that irrigated the Pueblo. In 1890, the Pueblo had 60 acres of peaches, plum, and apricot trees. The Mission Church of San Agustin at Isleta Pueblo is pictured here between 1880 and 1890. The original church was built around 1613. Phases of reconstruction of the church began after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and was completed by 1776 under the guidance of Bishop Pedro Tamaron. The original church was built close to the Rio Grande, which caused periodic flooding. During a reconstruction effort in 1959, workers found the log coffin of Fray Juan Jose Padilla that had made its way to the surface because of the high water table. Pathologists confirmed that the remains were that of the priest who died in 1756. A concrete foundation was put in place so that Father Padilla could finally rest in peace. New Mexico is the only state in the Union with 19 distinct Indian pueblos. Unlike Native Americans in other parts of the country, the Pueblo people still live on their ancestral land. It's the only place in America where an ancient way of life is part of everyday life for New Mexico, the land of enchantment.